Hey you guys, this is Professor Vitt. This is our lecture on Chapter 10, Sensory Anomalies and Hallucinations. Just kind of put this here because it accurately reflects the subject matter to a degree. Generally speaking, that's how I feel right now. As we muscle through the last chapter, I've been recovering from back injury, and I'm quite certain of the ability of the mind to hallucinate. Not really, I'm kind of joking. But I apologize in advance if this lecture is a little bit loopy. I'm not quite myself. But this will be an interesting lecture for me. I don't know how interesting it will be for you. All right, let's get on to it. The basic idea behind this lecture is how is it possible for us to see something that's not really there? The idea is like, we're pretty good at figuring out, this is a cup and it's real. How could you possibly have an experience that was really anomalous, like you see a Bigfoot or you see a light move around in the sky and behave in erratic ways? How could that possibly result in some kind of hallucination or something? How could that be a hallucination? How can we see what is not there? And the general outline of this lecture is just going to be, we'll talk about some sensory phenomena, sleep paralysis, and then something unfortunately named the Hag Phenomenon, which is certainly a term I don't use, but it has a clinical basis here, but it's not one I'm super fond of because of the term. But we'll get to that in just a second. Okay, first up, so we're looking for alternative explanations for how we might misperceive something, or how what we think we see we're not really seeing. One of them is called the autokinetic effect, and what this really means is your mind, your eye moves a bit, and you're not aware of it. And if you stare at this figure here, you can see actually it kind of begins to shimmer a little bit and move almost in a strange way. That's your eye moving around. You're just not aware of it. So the saying goes that there are some, you could think you're seeing a moving light in the sky, when in fact it's not really moving. It's your eye creating that effect. Next thing that Dr. Smith discusses is the pupil response, which is everybody is more or less familiar with when your pupils expand to create more light. Well, sometimes what happens is your pupil response is triggered in a funny way for the wrong reason, and what that does is it makes you think there's perhaps a shadow there when in fact there's not. And this doesn't happen all the time. Obviously, our pupils generally work pretty well, but it could lead you to think that perhaps there's a shadow in a room, and then when you focus on it, you draw your attention to it, the shadow sort of dissipates or goes away, and you might think that's a shadow person. If you Google shadow people, you'll see there's a profound amount of material on shadow people, people sort of taking pictures and claiming these are shadow people and so forth. But this is an attempt to provide an alternative explanation for what someone is seeing. Another type of sensory phenomena is broadly categorized as entopic phenomena, which is just, entopic is just a fancy name for saying from the eye itself. One of these is called a floater. These are impurities in your eyes, the fluid of your eyes. I used to get these as a very young child, perhaps 3 or 4 years old. I remember them distinctly because I used to think that they were real and that they were in the air, and I used to get a number of these sort of connected little bubbles together, and I used to get worried that they would collide and so forth. But it's actually debris in your eye. Now, if you're not familiar with this as a phenomena, or you're unable to explain it, it would be very easy to misperceive this kind of thing as lights or rings. Very often they're rings, and you can see where now you're off and running, right? If you see something like that, you're not aware of the phenomena. Well, that looks much like an object, And so debris in the eye can be seen as external to the eye, and that could account for seeing something in the sky that shouldn't be there. Now, another type of entopic phenomena is called blue field. What does this mean? Essentially, you see little white blood cells in your eyes, and you can see it across a blue background. And this is a simulation of what it looks like, and I'm not sure that you're going to be able to pick that up. I don't think the screencast is going to pick up the fine grain there, but you can see there's some white dots here and here. So again, you might see these cluster, think that's a cluster of objects external to you, or you might think it's a spiritual substance or something like that. Next, the next item up for discussion is something called a vascular figure. That's when you're seeing your blood vessels, essentially. It does happen. And then there's something called phosphenes. I think we cover phosphenes are, I knew that slide had 2 extra little bits of text on there. Phosphenes are when you push your hands against your eyes. You can generate them right now. And there are other conditions under which these can arise. And you can think that you're seeing light when there is no source of light. Another extremely interesting sensory phenomenon, and the book goes into this quite a bit, is when you have people who can, it's a rare neurological condition, but people do have it. And so when you have a planet of 6 billion people, you can see stuff like this in larger numbers of people who can taste colors. Or, excuse me, taste is experience like a color. So there's a famous wine expert who, I think his sense of smell allows him to see colors, and so he evaluates wine based on the color that he sees when he smells them. And then occasionally you'll hear accounts of people who are taking psychedelic drugs or psychotropic drugs, and they essentially have this occur where they will taste music or something like that, or they will so it's kind of far out, but it does happen, and this can lead to a broad array of misinterpretations. And you can imagine, and so people can just see a person and see an aura around them, and it looks very real to them, but what's happening is the mind has got an error there, the brain has an error there, the neurological system does, and so they have this unusual effect. But prior to our understanding of neurological systems, I mean, good luck trying to explain that to someone. So there are lots of things that are coming out now with regard to science that allow us to explain how we might misperceive things. Now, the book spends a lot of time talking about migraines and how migraines might cause you to see auras and all sorts of stuff. I leave that to you to review. One thing that is interesting is something called the tunnel effect, or a tunnel experience. And here what we really mean is an illusion of motion effect. So it looks like something is kind of moving here in this tunnel. But in fact, nothing is moving. It's that one light turns off and then another one turns on, and your mind fills in the gaps. So you have a light on, then it goes off and a light goes on, and your mind will mimic a sort of motion for you. And that's what's going on in this tunnel experience. By the way, just for the record, tunnel experience, this illusion of motion effect is very famous in ufology. There's an account by Dr. J. Allen Hynek concerning the nature of sighting, and he claims, well, swamp gas is on fire here, then the swamp gas goes out here, and then it turns on here, and your brain fills in the gap. Notoriously derided by ufologists, but a psychological phenomenon, but they just don't agree that it would apply in that circumstance. If you have an interest in that, please feel free to email me and I'll let you know more about it. Now, there are a variety of hallucinations, and again, the book goes through them here. We are going to focus more so on sleep paralysis and how it relates to alien abductions. Why would anyone believe that someone's being abducted by aliens? Well, this is where confirmation bias comes in, where it just seems like it's just not going to be believable to you, so you won't believe it. So let me do my best to try and present a case here. people believe in given the consistent elements of abduction stories, of paralysis, and when they take place, and so forth, that these are not just figments of the mind, because they are consistent across different types of people or groups of people. Also, the number of people who to testify to this sort of thing is pretty alarming. Some of the larger abductee conferences can involve hundreds of abductees. Also, if you've ever spoken to someone who's willing to talk to you about this, they're as serious as a heart attack. This is not a laughing matter to them. In fact, these are very often awful experiences that involve all kinds of physical and mental, even spiritual violations. Not always. Some of them are positive, but and then occasionally people will appeal to young children and say that they're just too young to fabricate such a story. What would be an alternative explanation or a skeptical explanation that Dr. Smith would provide? He would say something like, well, you have sleep paralysis, then you combine this with communal reinforcement, a bunch of people talking about it together, you combine that with memory errors, and boom, you get abductee experiences. We're going to focus here on sleep paralysis and how it relates to abductee experiences. It's essentially a period when you cannot perform voluntary movements. It's either at the beginning or the end of sleep. I've had sleep paralysis in my life. It is absolutely terrifying. Wow. And I've read accounts of ones that are even worse. They can go on for a while. I was unable to move at all. I couldn't even blink. I had total paralysis, and I thought I was awake. I was probably in between, but there was something sort of in this room. This is when I was a graduate student in New York City, and I couldn't see it. It was just outside my field of vision, but it was there. And it was an awful, sort of terrifying experience. Now, I don't think this was an alien or anything like that, but I can attest to the vividness of these experiences. They're quite real, and it's very alarming. What does this mean? Well, and so again, this is just me here. These can seem very real, very realistic hallucinations, a variety of sounds, out-of-body experiences. There's a presence in the room. You could even touch them. There's one account of a woman who was being attacked by a vampire, a female vampire, at her feet, and she was grabbing onto her feet and saying awful things to her about dragging her to the netherworld or something like that. And this went on for a long time. If this has ever happened to you, you know it's extremely disturbing. So I can't stress enough how real sleep paralysis is. And when you look back through sort of a chart or a shattered glass of history, there's something called the Hag Phenomenon. And the idea is that something, insert culture here, comes in and sits on a chest. And then Europeans thought it was a ghoulish hag or a witch, right? Now, you notice they didn't mention it was a male, so there's probably some cultural conditioning there. Of course, it's going to be a female, but there are male demons that perform the same type of thing. And so this is where it's very regrettable that there's this term, Hag Phenomena. I consider it a sexist term, but it's sort of pseudo-clinical, so I use it in reference here, should you run across it in the literature. But it's not my term, and it's not one I like. The attackers can be seen by their victims, and they feel real, but the moment someone regains control of their body, the thing disappears. When you look through history, you have this. You've got Greeks and Roman Greek manuscripts on this, and some Roman ones too. And throughout the culture, you have this some type of spiritual or magical or mythical creature attacking someone while they're sleeping. Now we have just a brief discussion of what might trigger hallucinations when you're waking. And one of them would be deprivation of food or oxygen or sleep. Another would be reduced sensory input. There is a very interesting phenomenon that occurs with people who are have reduced sensory input. You can put someone in an isolation tank and your mind will start to generate pictures and content and voices and so forth that can generate a hallucination. Also, there are stories of Lindbergh felt a presence when he was flying, and anyway, we could go on forever on that. Let's move on to stimulus overload. When you have prolonged and repetitive external stimulation, you can have a hallucination. Note here that this is not my language. Repetitive religious ritual. Yeah, that's Dr. Smith sort of, it is his book. I don't agree with that characterization, though. It sort of puts the cart before the horse, but it's not the scope of this class. Okay, and then lastly, stressful and strenuous situations, trauma or bereavement can trigger hallucination. I think we talked about bereavement hallucinations earlier. Very, very common. If we didn't, one study was 80% of elderly couples, so a widow or widower, person who has a spouse die, will actually have a hallucination, or in some cases even conversations with them. So these hallucinations can be auditory, visual, both. They're very, very common. And I've actually had a bereavement illusion before. I assume it was an illusion. Very, very real. And then, of course, alcohol and drugs can cause all sorts of hallucinations. Alcohol, that would probably take an awful lot, I think, to generate a hallucination. But obviously, drugs have the capacity to alter brain chemistry, and alcohol is a drug, so it does seem conceivable anyway. Okay, and then for this latter discussion of this hallucination model and so forth, I just refer you to 215 to 220 in the book for purposes of review. And then there's a little overview here in that same section, just after it, the 4 pages after that, 220 to 224, concerning various clinical psychological states and how they might be mistaken for the paranormal. I will leave that to you as an exercise, and the same there. So, okay, hopefully you guys have gotten enough out of this lecture to move forward. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me, rvitt@lbcc.edu. This concludes the course and the lecture portion of the course. So I want to thank you for sticking through it with me, and also being real gracious with regard to my delay in getting this last lecture up. Okay, thanks much, and it has been a great pleasure.